please don't do this to us. We're your parents," my mother whispered through tears as she clutched the foreclosure notice I just handed her. "We raised you. We fed you. We—" Her voice cracked. My father, the same man who'd called me a worthless disappointment and thrown my belongings onto the front lawn 5 years earlier, couldn't even look me in the eye. He just stood there in the doorway of the house I now owned, the house where I'd grown up being told I'd never amount to anything. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter they'd kicked out for being too stupid for college and destined to flip burgers forever was now their landlord. The same girl they'd screamed at for wasting their money and embarrassing the family name was holding the deed to their home. And the child they'd convinced would never succeed at anything had just become the person who could decide whether they had a roof over their heads. I'm Victoria Hartwell, 27 years old, and this is the story of how I went from sleeping in my beat-up Honda Civic in a Walmart parking lot to owning a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. It's about how the people who were supposed to believe in me became my biggest enemies, and how their cruelty became the fuel that drove me to heights they never imagined possible. But most of all, it's about the moment when the tables turned so completely that the parents who once called me worthless were literally begging me not to destroy their lives. You might think this is a story about revenge. You'd be wrong. This is a story about justice, about proving that sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up giving you the greatest gift of all, the burning desire to prove them wrong. And trust me, what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about family, forgiveness, and what happens when the underdog finally gets their day. 5 years ago, I was standing in the rain outside my childhood home in Millbrook Heights, watching my father throw garbage bags full of my clothes onto the lawn. My crime? I'd gotten a B+ in chemistry instead of an A, and I dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't cut out to be the doctor they'd always demanded I become. "You're a failure," he'd screamed. "A complete and utter disappointment. We've wasted 18 years on you, and you can't even handle high school properly." My mother, Patricia, had stood in the window watching, her face cold as stone. When I'd looked up at her, hoping for some sign of compassion, she'd simply drawn the curtains closed. No goodbye, no "we love you anyway," just nothing. The neighbors were watching from their perfectly manicured yards as Harold Hartwell made a spectacle of disowning his only daughter. Mrs. Chen from next door actually came outside with her phone, recording the whole thing like it was some kind of entertainment. That night, soaked to the bone and with nowhere to go, I made a promise to myself in the front seat of my car. I was going to succeed so spectacularly, so undeniably, that they would choke on every cruel word they'd ever said to me. I was going to build something so impressive that the entire town of Millbrook Heights would know their worthless daughter had become everything they said she never could be. But here's the thing about being kicked out at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and $247 to your name. The world doesn't care about your promises to yourself. The world doesn't care that you're motivated by pain so deep it feels like it might consume you. The world just keeps spinning, and you either figure out how to catch up or you get left behind. I worked 3 jobs that first year. Mornings at Sunrise Diner flipping eggs and serving coffee to truckers. Afternoons at Greenfield Mall selling overpriced jewelry to suburban moms. Nights cleaning offices downtown, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while listening to audiobooks on real estate investing. I lived in that car for 8 months, showering at the local gym, doing laundry at the 24-hour laundromat, and saving every penny I could. My parents? They told everyone I'd run off and was probably on drugs somewhere. When people asked about me at church or the country club, they'd shake their heads sadly and say I'd chosen a different path and they were praying for my return to sanity. They even changed their phone number so I couldn't contact them. Not that I was trying to. The message was clear. Victoria Hartwell was dead to them. What they didn't know was that their dead daughter was studying, learning, growing. Every night in that car, I was reading everything I could get my hands on about business, about real estate, about building wealth from nothing. I was watching YouTube videos on my cracked phone screen, taking notes in composition books I'd bought from the dollar store. I was becoming someone they never expected me to be, someone who understood that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting ahead. By year 2, I'd saved enough for a deposit on a studio apartment in the rough part of Eastwick. It wasn't much, 400 square feet with a leaky faucet and neighbors who played music too loud, but it was mine.
And by year 5, well, that's when I discovered that my parents' perfect little world in Millbrook Heights wasn't so perfect after all. That's when I learned that Harold and Patricia Hartwell, the couple who'd been so concerned about their reputation and their standing in the community, had been living a lie that was about to come crashing down around them. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in September. I was reviewing contracts in my downtown office. Yes, I had an office by then, with my name on the door and everything. When my assistant buzzed in. "Miss Hartwell, there's a gentleman from Millbrook Savings and Loan on line 2. Says it's about a property acquisition opportunity." I almost didn't take the call. Almost. But something made me pick up that phone, and the words that came through the receiver made my heart stop. "Miss Hartwell, we have a situation with a property at 847 Maple Street in Millbrook Heights. The owners are 3 months behind on payments, and we're looking at foreclosure proceedings. Given your track record with distressed properties, we thought you might be interested in making an offer." 847 Maple Street. I knew that address by heart. I'd lived there for 18 years. It was my childhood home, my parents' house, the house where I'd been told I was worthless, the house where I had been thrown out like garbage. And now? Now they were about to lose it. What happened next will shock you. What I discovered about my parents' financial situation will make you question everything you think you know about the people who seem to have it all together. And what I decided to do with this information? Well, let's just say that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor that's almost too perfect to believe. I'm Victoria Hartwell, and before I tell you what happened when I discovered my parents were about to lose their house, you need to understand exactly who I am and how I got here. Because the woman holding that foreclosure notice wasn't the same broken 18-year-old who'd been thrown out into the rain 5 years earlier. At 27, I own Hartwell Properties, a real estate investment company with a portfolio worth $3.2 million. I control 17 rental properties across 3 counties, have a team of 6 employees, and last year alone, I flipped 12 houses for a combined profit of $890,000. Not bad for someone who was supposedly too stupid for college and destined to flip burgers forever, right? But those numbers don't tell the real story. They don't capture the 60-hour work weeks, the nights I fell asleep reading real estate law books, or the countless times I wanted to give up when everyone around me said I was crazy for thinking a high school dropout could make it in real estate. They don't show you the rejection letters from banks who wouldn't even look at my loan applications, or the sellers who literally laughed when I tried to make offers on properties. What they really don't show you is the fire that's been burning in my chest for 5 years straight. The kind of determination that only comes from having the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally tell you that you're worthless. That's a special kind of motivation, and it's carried me through every obstacle, every setback, every moment when the smart thing would have been to quit. I started with nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing. When my parents kicked me out, I had $247 in my savings account, a 2003 Honda Civic with 180,000 miles on it, and a high school diploma from Millbrook Heights Academy, the same private school where my father served on the board of trustees and my mother chaired the fundraising committee. Ironic, considering they always said I was an embarrassment to the family name. My first office was the front seat of that Honda. My first business plan was written on napkins from Sunrise Diner during my 15-minute breaks. My first real education came from YouTube videos I watched on my phone in the Walmart parking lot where I lived for 8 months. Not exactly the typical path to success. But then again, I've never been typical. The turning point came during month 6 of living in my car.
I was working the night shift at Consolidated Cleaning Services, mopping floors in a downtown office building, when I overheard a conversation between two businessmen who'd stayed late. They were talking about a duplex they just bought for $85,000, how they were going to fix it up and rent it out for $1,200 a month. Basic math told me that was $14,400 a year in rental income on an $85,000 investment. Even with expenses, repairs, and taxes, they were looking at a solid return. That's when it hit me. Real estate wasn't just about having money. It was about understanding money, understanding value, understanding how to make other people's money work for you. These guys weren't geniuses. They weren't special. They just knew something I didn't know yet. So I decided to learn everything they knew and then some. I got my real estate license through a night program at Eastwick Community College. Took me 8 months while working 3 jobs, but I passed the exam on my first try with a 94%. My parents had always said I was too stupid for higher education. But apparently, I was smart enough to master contract law, property valuation, and market analysis while sleeping in a car and living on ramen noodles.
My first job in real estate was with Pinnacle Properties, a small firm in downtown Eastwick run by a woman named Jennifer Martinez. She took a chance on me when bigger companies wouldn't even return my calls. "You've got hunger," she told me. "I can teach you everything else, but I can't teach hunger." She was right. While other agents were going to happy hour networking events, I was knocking on doors in neighborhoods they wouldn't even drive through. While they were waiting for leads to come to them, I was generating my own by researching distressed properties and reaching out to motivated sellers. In my first year at Pinnacle, I closed $2.1 million in sales. In my second year, $3.8 million. By year 3, I was the top agent in the company and ready to strike out on my own. Jennifer understood. "You are never going to work for someone else forever," she said. "You're a builder, not an employee." She was right about that, too. I didn't just want to sell houses. I wanted to own them. I wanted to create something that would generate income while I slept, something that would grow even when I wasn't actively working on it. I wanted to build the kind of wealth that would make it impossible for anyone to ever make me feel small again. My first property purchase was a disaster. A 1,200 square foot ranch house in Riverside Gardens that I bought for $62,000. It needed everything. New roof, new plumbing, new electrical, new flooring. I'd estimated $15,000 in repairs. The actual cost was $28,000. I lost money on that flip, but I learned more in those 4 months than I had in the previous 2 years combined. The second property was better. A duplex in Oakwood that I bought for $78,000, put $12,000 into, and rented out for $1,350 a month total. Positive cash flow from day 1. That's when I knew I'd found my calling. Property number 3, 4, 5, each one taught me something new. How to spot foundation problems that sellers were trying to hide, how to negotiate with contractors who thought they could take advantage of a young woman, how to analyze neighborhoods and predict which areas were about to become hot markets. Most importantly, how to leverage equity from one property to buy the next one. By the time I was 26, I wasn't just successful, I was undeniably, spectacularly successful. The kind of successful that makes people ask how you did it. The kind of successful that gets you featured in the Eastwick Business Journal as 30 under 30 to watch. The kind of successful that proves every person who ever doubted you was catastrophically wrong. But here's what success really taught me. It's not about the money. It's not about the recognition. It's not even about proving the doubters wrong, though I'll admit that part feels pretty good. It's about becoming the person you were always meant to be, the person you would have been if the world hadn't tried to convince you to be smaller. I became Victoria Hartwell, real estate investor and businesswoman. But I was still that 18-year-old girl who'd been told she was worthless, still carrying that pain and anger like a weight in my chest, still wondering if my parents ever thought about me, ever regretted what they'd done, ever realized they'd thrown away their own daughter over a B+ in chemistry. I was about to find out. Before I tell you what I discovered about my parents' financial situation and the decision that changed everything,
I need to ask you something. Have you ever been told by the people who were supposed to love you most that you'd never amount to anything? Have you ever had someone look straight in the eye and tell you that you're worthless, that you're a waste of space, that you'll never succeed at anything meaningful in your life? If you have, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know that burning sensation in your chest, that mixture of rage and heartbreak that feels like it might consume you from the inside out. You know what it's like to lie awake at night, replaying those words over and over, wondering if maybe, just maybe, they were right about you. But here's what I've learned over the past 5 years, and I want you to really hear this. The people who try to make you feel small do it because they feel small themselves. The people who tell you that you can't achieve your dreams do it because they gave up on their dreams a long time ago. And the people who call you worthless, they're terrified that you might actually prove them wrong. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when someone underestimated you. I want to hear your story because I guarantee you're not alone in this, whether it was a parent, a teacher, a boss, or just someone who thought they knew better than you did about your own potential. I want to know how you proved them wrong. And if you haven't proved them wrong yet, tell me what you're working toward. This community is about lifting each other up, not tearing each other down. Hit that like button if you believe that your background doesn't determine your future. Hit it if you think that being told no just means you need to find a different way to get to yes. Hit it if you've ever been the underdog and use that as fuel to become something extraordinary.
And make sure you subscribe to this channel because what I'm about to share with you over the next few episodes will blow your mind. You're going to learn exactly how I went from sleeping in my car to owning my childhood home. You're going to see what happened when I walked back into my parents' lives with the power to decide their fate. And you're going to discover that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living so well that your enemies become irrelevant. But first, let me ask you this. What would you do if you had the power to destroy the people who destroyed you? Would you take it? Would you use it? Or would you find a different path entirely? Keep that question in mind as I tell you this story, because by the end of it, you might surprise yourself with your answer. You know what's interesting about success? It doesn't just change how other people see you, it changes how you see yourself. When I was 18 and homeless, living in my car and working 3 jobs just to survive, I thought success meant proving my parents wrong. I thought it meant showing them that their worthless daughter could actually amount to something. But real success, the kind that actually matters, isn't about other people at all. It's about becoming the version of yourself that you always knew was possible, the version that other people tried to convince you didn't exist. It's about building something so solid, so undeniably yours, that no one can ever take it away from you again. That's what I want for everyone watching this video. I don't care if you're 19 or 90, if you're starting with $1 million or starting with nothing at all. I want you to understand that you have the power to completely transform your life, and the only person who can stop you is you. But here's the thing. About transformation, it's not easy, it's not quick, and it's definitely not linear. There were nights during those first few years when I questioned everything, when I wondered if my parents had been right about me, when I thought about giving up and just accepting that maybe some people are meant to be successful and others aren't. I'm sharing this story with you because I want you to know that those moments of doubt are normal. They're part of the process. Every successful person I've ever met has had moments when they wanted to quit, when they wondered if they were crazy for believing in themselves when no one else did. The difference between people who succeed and people who don't isn't talent. It's not luck. It's not even intelligence, though that certainly doesn't hurt. The difference is persistence. It's the ability to keep going when everything inside you wants to stop. It's the willingness to fail, learn from that failure, and try again with better information. That's what this channel is really about. It's not just about real estate, though I'll definitely be sharing everything I've learned about building wealth through property investment. It's not just about my story, though I hope my journey inspires you to start your own.
It's about understanding that you have more power than you think you do, and that power grows every time you choose to bet on yourself instead of accepting other people's limitations. I get messages from viewers all the time telling me about their own transformations. Sarah from Phoenix, who went from working minimum wage retail to owning her own boutique marketing agency. Miguel from Chicago, who left his corporate job to start a food truck business that now has 3 locations. Jennifer from Atlanta, who went back to school at 45 to become a nurse practitioner and just bought her first house. These aren't special people. They're not different from you or me. They just decided that their current situation wasn't permanent and they were willing to do whatever it took to change it. That's what I want for you too. I want you to understand that your story isn't over. It doesn't matter what's happened to you up until this point. It doesn't matter who's told you you can't do something, who's made you feel small, who's convinced you that you should settle for less than you deserve. What matters is what you do next. So here's my challenge for you. Think about one thing you've always wanted to do but haven't done yet because someone told you it was impossible, impractical, or just not for people like you. Write it in the comments. Share it with this community. Make it real by putting it out there in the world. And then take one small step towards making it happen. Just one. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be forward movement. Because here's what I've learned. The path from where you are to where you want to be isn't a straight line. It's a series of small decisions, small actions, small steps that compound over time into something extraordinary. But it all starts with deciding that you're worth betting on yourself, that your dreams are worth pursuing, that you have something valuable to offer the world. My parents tried to convince me otherwise. They failed. And whatever voices are trying to convince you that you're not capable of greatness, they're going to fail too. Now, let me tell you what happened when I realized that the people who had thrown me away were about to lose everything they cared about most of all. Let me tell you about the phone call that gave me the power to be everything they said I couldn't be, and the choice I had to make about what kind of person I wanted to become.
Because that choice, that single moment of decision, changed not just my relationship with my parents, but my understanding of what it really means to win. To understand why that phone call from Millbrook Savings and Loan hit me like a freight train, you need to understand what the Hartwell family was really like behind closed doors. From the outside, we looked perfect. Harold Hartwell, successful insurance executive, pillar of the community, board member at 3 different organizations. Patricia Hartwell, socialite and volunteer extraordinaire, woman who organized charity galas and ran the annual Christmas fundraiser for Millbrook Heights Academy. We lived in the biggest house on Maple Street, a sprawling colonial with manicured gardens and a 3-car garage. We vacationed in the Hamptons every summer, had season tickets to the symphony, and never missed church on Sunday. Harold drove a BMW, Patricia had her Mercedes, and I was expected to maintain a 4.0 GPA while participating in exactly the right extracurricular activities to ensure admission to an Ivy League university. But perfection comes with a price, and in the Hartwell household, that price was paid by anyone who dared to be human. My earliest memory is being 4 years old and getting screamed at for spilling grape juice on the white living room carpet. Not scolded, screamed at. Patricia stood over me, face red with rage, telling me how clumsy I was, how disappointing, how I needed to be more careful because nice things aren't for careless children. Harold came home from work that evening, saw the stain that hadn't quite come out despite hours of cleaning, and made me stand in the corner for 2 hours thinking about what I'd done wrong. I learned early that love in the Hartwell house was conditional. It was based on performance, on meeting expectations, on never, ever embarrassing the family name. A- on a test? Grounded for a week. 2nd place in the science fair. Why wasn't it 1st place? Invited to a birthday party for a child whose parents weren't part of the right social circle? We don't associate with those kinds of people, Victoria. School events were particularly brutal. Parent-teacher conferences where I sat in the hallway listening to Harold and Patricia discuss my potential and areas for improvement, like I was a business investment that wasn't performing to expectations. Award ceremonies where they'd smile and clap politely, then spend the car ride home explaining everything I'd done wrong in my presentation, or why my achievement wasn't quite as impressive as so-and-so's child. I remember being 12 and winning the county spelling bee. I was so excited, so proud, so sure that finally, I'd done something that would make them happy. The trophy was beautiful, gold-plated with my name engraved on it. When I handed it to Harold in the car, he looked at it for exactly 3 seconds before saying, "Well, at least you're good at memorizing. Too bad that won't help you in the real world." Patricia nodded in agreement. Spelling bees are fine for children, but you need to focus on things that actually matter, like mathematics and science, and learning to present yourself properly in social situations. That night, I put the trophy on my bookshelf and cried myself to sleep, not because I was sad, but because I finally understood that nothing I did would ever be good enough. The goalposts would always move, the expectations would always increase, and my parents would always find something wrong, something lacking, something disappointing about who I was. High school was worse. Every grade was scrutinized, every friendship was evaluated, every activity was measured against how it would look on college applications. I wasn't allowed to date. Boys are a distraction from your studies. I wasn't allowed to get a part-time job. Your job is to excel academically. I wasn't allowed to choose my own clothes, my own hairstyle, or even my own electives. When other kids were experimenting with independence, figuring out who they wanted to be, I was being molded into Harold and Patricia's vision of the perfect daughter. Pre-med track, naturally. Volunteer work that looked good on applications, but never anything I was actually passionate about. Leadership positions in clubs I had no interest in joining. The worst part wasn't the control itself. It was the way they made me believe it was love. "We're doing this because we care about your future," Patricia would say when I complained about not being allowed to go to a friend's house. "We're pushing you because we believe in your potential," Harold would add when I protested about the impossible standards. They had me convinced that their criticism was motivation, that their disappointment was just high expectations, and that their constant monitoring was protection. I actually felt grateful for their involvement, guilty when I didn't live up to their standards, and ashamed when I wanted things they didn't approve of. Looking back now, I can see what was really happening. Harold and Patricia Hartwell were living through me. Their own lives had become about maintaining appearances, about status and reputation and what the neighbors thought. I wasn't their daughter. I was their project, their chance to create something that would reflect well on them, that would validate their choices and elevate their standing in the community. But here's the thing about treating a human being like a project. Eventually, that human being starts to crack under the pressure. The crack started small. A B+ in AP chemistry instead of the A I'd maintained all semester. It wasn't because I wasn't trying. I was studying 4 hours a night, working with a tutor, doing extra credit assignments. Chemistry just didn't click for me the way other subjects did. My brain worked differently, processed information differently, and no amount of effort was going to change that fundamental fact.
But Harold and Patricia didn't see it that way. They saw failure. They saw embarrassment. They saw their perfect daughter project falling apart, and they panicked. The screaming started immediately, not just about the grade, but about everything. How I was lazy, how I wasn't applying myself, how I was throwing away my future and theirs along with it. How disappointed they were, how humiliated they felt, how I was ruining everything they'd worked so hard to build. Then came the threats. No car privileges, no college applications to anywhere except the schools they approved of. No freedom until I proved I was serious about my education again. No phone, no friends, no life outside of studying until that grade was brought up to their standards. But the worst part was the silence. When the screaming stopped, when the threats had been made, Harold and Patricia simply stopped seeing me. They'd walk past me in the hallway like I wasn't there. They'd discuss my future in the third person while I sat at the dinner table. They'd make plans for family events without including me, then act surprised when I asked if I was invited. It was psychological warfare, and I was 18 years old with no frame of reference for understanding that what was happening to me wasn't normal, wasn't loving, wasn't acceptable. The final breaking point came when I suggested that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't cut out to be a doctor. Maybe I was better suited for something else, something that played to my actual strengths instead of trying to force me into their predetermined mold. That's when Harold looked me in the eye and called me worthless for the first time. Not disappointing, not underperforming, worthless. And that's when I finally understood that I had never been their daughter. I had been their investment. And investments that don't pay off get discarded. What I didn't know then was that while they were busy discarding me, Harold and Patricia were making investment decisions of their own that would come back to haunt them in ways they never imagined. The first night in my car, I parked behind a 24-hour laundromat in downtown Eastwick and cried until I couldn't breathe. Not because I was homeless, though that was terrifying, but because I finally understood that the parents who had shaped my entire worldview, who had convinced me that their love was conditional on my performance, had just performed the ultimate act of abandonment. They had chosen their reputation over their daughter, and there was no coming back from that. But somewhere between the tears and the terror, something else emerged, a clarity I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't performing for anyone. I wasn't trying to meet impossible standards or live up to someone else's vision of who I should be. I was just Victoria, alone in a beat-up Honda Civic with $247 and absolutely nothing to lose. That realization was more powerful than I could have imagined. The next morning, I drove to Sunrise Diner, a 24-hour place near the interstate where truckers and night shift workers grabbed coffee and eggs. The manager, a woman named Rosa Martinez, with kind eyes and calloused hands, took one look at me and knew I was desperate. When I asked about work, she didn't ask for references or experience. She just handed me an apron and said, "You start now. $6 an hour plus tips, and you can eat one meal per shift." That meal was crucial. It meant I only needed to buy food once a day instead of 3 times. Rosa also let me use the employee bathroom to wash up and change clothes, which probably saved my life during those first few weeks. She never asked why I was living in my car, never made me feel ashamed, never treated me like a charity case. She just gave me a chance to work, and work became my salvation. The lunch shift at Sunrise paid for gas and basic necessities. The afternoon job at Sparkle Jewelry in Greenfield Mall covered car insurance and the gym membership I needed for showers. The night cleaning job at Consolidated Building Services, that was my real money. $8 an hour to empty trash cans and mop floors in downtown office buildings. But it was quiet work that left my mind free to plan, to dream, to figure out what came next. Most importantly, those office buildings were where I got my real education. While I cleaned conference rooms and executive suites, I'd see whiteboards covered with business plans, contracts left on desks, books about investments and real estate scattered around. I started photographing interesting documents with my phone, not to steal ideas, but to learn the language of business, to understand how successful people thought about money and opportunity. That's how I discovered real estate investing. A book called Building Wealth Through Property, left open on some executive's desk, filled with highlighted passages about leveraging equity and cash flow analysis. I took a photo of the cover, went to the library on my day off, and checked it out. Then I read every real estate book they had, taking notes in composition books I bought at the dollar store. The learning was intoxicating. For the first time since elementary school, I was studying something because I wanted to, not because someone was forcing me to. Every concept I mastered felt like a small victory. Every strategy I understood felt like power accumulating in my hands. My parents had always said I wasn't smart enough for business, but here I was, teaching myself complex financial concepts while living in a car and working 3 jobs. Month 6 was when everything clicked. I'd saved $3,400, enough for a security deposit on a studio apartment in Riverside Gardens, the rough part of Eastwick where rent was cheap and questions were few.
The apartment was 400 square feet with a leaky faucet and paper-thin walls, but it had four crucial things: a bed, a shower, an address, and privacy. That address meant I could get a library card, which meant unlimited internet access for research. The privacy meant I could study without interruption. I threw myself into learning with the same intensity my parents had once demanded for subjects I hated. The difference was, this time I was learning for me. Real estate law, market analysis, financing strategies, negotiation tactics. I devoured it all. I signed up for night classes at Eastwick Community College, paying out of pocket for a real estate licensing program that meant twice a week from 7 to 10 p.m. The other students thought I was crazy. Most of them were career changers in their 40s and 50s, people with established lives and financial cushions who were looking for a new direction. Here I was, 19 years old, working 3 jobs and living in a studio apartment that smelled like cigarettes, taking notes on legal pads because I couldn't afford a laptop. But I had something they didn't: desperation channeled into determination. While they studied to pass the test, I studied to transform my life. While they memorized information for the exam, I absorbed it like my survival depended on it, because it did. I passed the licensing exam with a 94%, higher than anyone else in my class. The instructor, Robert Chen, pulled me aside afterward and asked what my plans were. When I told him I wanted to start selling properties immediately, he laughed, not cruelly, but with surprise. "Most people need 6 months to get comfortable with the business," he said. "You sound like you're ready to start tomorrow." He was right. I'd been preparing for this moment for 8 months, and I was ready to turn all that theoretical knowledge into real money. Getting hired was harder than getting licensed. Established firms wanted agents with experience or connections or both. They wanted people who could bring their own clients, who understood the social dynamics of selling expensive homes to wealthy buyers. I had none of that. What I had was hunger, knowledge, and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Jennifer Martinez at Pinnacle Properties was the 7th firm I approached, and the first one willing to take a chance on me. "You know this business better than agents I've been working with for years," she said after I answered her rapid-fire questions about contract law and market trends. "But knowledge isn't everything. Can you handle rejection? Because you're going to get a lot of it." She wasn't kidding. My first month, I made exactly 0 sales. My second month, 0 again. Other agents were closing deals while I was getting hung up on, laughed at, and dismissed. The problem wasn't my knowledge, it was my market. I was trying to sell expensive homes to people who took one look at my age and assumed I didn't know what I was talking about. That's when I shifted strategies. Instead of competing with experienced agents for established buyers, I started targeting motivated sellers, people who needed to sell quickly and cared more about results than appearances. Divorce situations, job relocations, inherited properties that families couldn't afford to maintain. These sellers didn't care if their agent was 19 or 90. They cared about competence and speed. I found these opportunities by doing the work other agents wouldn't do: cold calling expired listings, driving through neighborhoods looking for for sale by owner signs, researching public records for properties with tax liens or upcoming foreclosures. While other agents waited for leads to come to them, I was generating my own through pure effort and persistence. My first sale came in month 3, a townhouse in Brookside that had been on the market for 8 months with 2 previous agents. The seller, Mrs. Angela Rodriguez, was relocating for work and getting desperate. I priced it aggressively, marketed it to investors as well as traditional buyers, and closed the deal in 3 weeks. Commission, $4,200. More money than I'd ever had at one time in my life. But more than the money was the realization I was good at this. Really good. I understood how to read people, how to identify their real motivations beyond what they said they wanted. I could analyze properties and markets in ways that helped both buyers and sellers make smart decisions. I could negotiate deals that left everyone feeling like they'd won. By the end of my first year, I'd closed $2.1 million in sales and earned $68,000 in commissions. By the end of year 2, $3.8 million in sales and $127,000 in earnings. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving, and every success felt like another nail in the coffin of my parents' prediction that I'd never amount to anything. But selling real estate for other people, no matter how successfully, was never the end goal. It was just the foundation for what I really wanted to build: a property empire that would generate wealth for decades to come. Success has a funny way of making people who ignored you suddenly very interested in your life. By my third year in real estate, word was getting around Millbrook Heights that Harold and Patricia Hartwell's failure daughter was actually doing quite well for herself. The same social circles that had whispered about my disgraceful departure were now buzzing with curiosity about my growing reputation in the business community.
The first sign something was shifting came through my high school friend, Rebecca Chen, whose mother still lived 3 houses down from my parents on Maple Street. Rebecca called me one Tuesday evening, her voice filled with that particular excitement people get when they have juicy gossip to share. "Victoria, you're not going to believe this," she said. "My mom was at the country club yesterday, and guess whose parents were asking about you?" I was reviewing property comparables for a listing presentation, only half listening. "Whose parents?" "Yours," she said. "Apparently, your mother cornered my mom at the tennis courts and spent 20 minutes asking questions about what you've been up to, where you're living, what kind of work you're doing, whether you're seeing anyone special." My mom said it was super weird because Patricia kept emphasizing how much they miss you and how they've been trying to find a way to reconnect. That got my attention. I set down my papers and focused on the conversation. What exactly did she say? She told my mom that you'd had a misunderstanding about your future plans, but that enough time had passed for everyone to cool down. She said they've been hearing wonderful things about your success and that they're ready to welcome you back into the family whenever you're ready to talk. I almost laughed. A misunderstanding, as if being called worthless and thrown out of the house was some kind of communication error that could be smoothed over with enough time and good intentions. But what bothered me wasn't Patricia's revisionist history. It was the timing. Why now? Why, after 3 years of complete silence, were my parents suddenly interested in my life? What had changed? The answer started becoming clear over the next few weeks as more information trickled in through the Millbrook Heights gossip network. My name had been mentioned in the Eastwick Business Journal's Rising Stars feature. I'd been photographed at a charity auction where I'd successfully bid on a weekend getaway package. Most importantly, I'd been seen at several high-end restaurants with clients, clearly conducting business, clearly successful. The Millbrook Heights rumor mill had done what it did best, taken scattered pieces of information and woven them into a story. And the story they'd created was that Victoria Hartwell, the daughter who'd been lost for a few years, had found her way back to respectability and was probably doing quite well financially. The second sign came when I started getting friend requests on social media from people I hadn't spoken to since high school. Not just casual acquaintances, but specifically people who moved in the same circles as my parents. Jennifer Walsh, whose father golfed with Harold. Michael Rodriguez, whose mother served on charity committees with Patricia. Ashley Chen, Rebecca's cousin who still lived in Millbrook Heights and attended my parents' church. Each friend request came with a message. "So great to see you're doing well. Would love to catch up sometime. Heard amazing things about your career." They were fishing for information, and they weren't being subtle about it. Every conversation steered toward questions about my work, my income, my living situation, my future plans. I realized my parents were conducting reconnaissance. They weren't ready to approach me directly, their pride wouldn't allow that, and they probably weren't sure how I'd react after 3 years of silence. But they were definitely gathering intelligence about whether their worthless daughter might actually be worth reconnecting with. The third sign was the most telling. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, my parents' next-door neighbor for 15 years, suddenly needed to sell her house. She contacted Pinnacle Properties specifically asking for me, claiming she'd heard wonderful things about my work and wanted to support local talent. This was strange for several reasons. First, Mrs. Whitman had barely acknowledged my existence when I lived at home, treating me with the polite indifference she reserved for the landscaping crew and other service providers. Second, her house wasn't the type of property I typically handled. It was an $800,000 estate that would normally go to one of the senior agents with established wealthy clientele. Third, she kept asking oddly specific questions about my business that had nothing to do with selling her house. "I imagine you must be doing quite well for someone so young. Real estate can be very lucrative for those who understand it properly."
"How many properties do you sell in a typical year?" she asked while I was measuring rooms. "Do you work with many investors? I imagine that's where the real money is," she commented as we discussed pricing strategy. Each question felt like it was being filed away for future reference. And given that Mrs. Whitman and my mother had coffee every Thursday morning for the past decade, I was pretty sure I knew where that information was headed. But the most unsettling sign came when I started getting anonymous tips about properties that might be coming on the market. A text message with an address and "might be motivated to sell soon." A voicemail with information about an estate situation that hadn't been publicly announced yet. An email with details about a company relocation that would trigger multiple employee home sales. The information was always accurate, always valuable, and always untraceable. Someone with connections to Millbrook Heights social and business networks was feeding me inside information about potential listings. Someone who knew my business well enough to understand what kind of opportunities would be most valuable to me. Someone who wanted me to be successful and profitable, and who had reasons for wanting me in their debt. I started paying closer attention to who was driving past my apartment building in Eastwick. Started noticing cars that seemed to follow the same routes I took to showings. Started getting the distinct feeling that my life was being observed and evaluated by people who haven't cared about my existence for 3 years.
The culmination came when I received a formal invitation to the Millbrook Heights Academy's annual alumni gala. This was significant for several reasons. First, I'd never been invited before. The gala was traditionally for graduates who had distinguished themselves in their careers or made substantial donations to the school. Second, the invitation was personalized with a handwritten note from the development director. "We'd be honored to celebrate your remarkable success in real estate." Third, and most importantly, the gala was being held at the Millbrook Country Club, where my parents were members, where Patricia served on the event planning committee, and where Harold would definitely be in attendance. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an orchestrated opportunity for accidentally running into my parents in a public setting where social expectations would require everyone to be polite and civilized, where any scene or confrontation would be witnessed by the entire Millbrook Heights social elite, where my parents could test the waters of reconnection without the risk of private rejection. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks while I debated what to do. Part of me was curious about what they wanted, what their end game was. Part of me was angry that they thought they could manipulate me back into their lives through social engineering and peer pressure. And part of me, the part that was still that 18-year-old girl who desperately wanted their approval, wondered if maybe they had genuinely changed, if maybe they were ready to accept me as I was. I RSVP'd yes. What I didn't know was that while my parents were carefully orchestrating their campaign to reconnect with their successful daughter, their own carefully constructed life was beginning to crumble in ways they were desperate to hide. And my attendance at that gala would give them the opening they needed to implement a plan that would make their earlier manipulation look like child's play. Because it turned out that Harold and Patricia Hartwell needed their worthless daughter a lot more than they were willing to admit. I spent 3 hours getting ready for the alumni gala, changing outfits 4 times before settling on a navy blue dress that struck the right balance between successful and understated. I wanted to look like I belonged in the Millbrook Country Club's marble-columned ballroom, but I also wanted to make it clear that I wasn't trying to impress anyone. The girl who'd been thrown out in the rain was gone. In her place was a woman who'd built her own life, her own success, her own identity. The country club looked exactly as I remembered it. Crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of long-dead members, and an atmosphere of quiet wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Alumni filled the ballroom, clustering around cocktail tables and speaking in the measured tones of people who'd learned to modulate their voices in sacred spaces. I recognized most of the faces, though few seemed to recognize me initially. That changed when Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the headmistress of the academy, spotted me near the registration table. "Victoria Hartwell," she exclaimed, loud enough to turn heads.
Look at you! We've been following your career with such interest. The development office tells me you're one of the most successful young real estate professionals in the region. Suddenly, I was surrounded by classmates I hadn't spoken to since graduation, teachers who remembered me as a quiet, studious girl, and academy board members who were very interested in hearing about my remarkable transformation. The attention was overwhelming and oddly validating. These were people who'd known me during my parents' reign of perfectionist terror, and they were seeing me now as an adult who'd succeeded on her own terms. I was deep in conversation with my former AP English teacher when I felt eyes on me from across the room. I looked up, and there they were, Harold and Patricia Hartwell, standing near the silent auction display, watching me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Patricia was wearing the same pearl necklace she'd worn to every formal event since I was 12. Harold was in his standard black tuxedo, the one he'd had tailored at Brooks Brothers 15 years ago, and still fit perfectly because he'd never gained or lost a pound. They looked exactly the same, which somehow made the moment more surreal. In my mind, they'd become larger than life, mythical figures whose approval had once meant everything, and whose rejection had nearly destroyed me. But standing there in the country club ballroom, they just looked like middle-aged people at a social function, no more or less significant than any other couple in evening wear. Patricia noticed I was looking and nudged Harold. They exchanged a brief conversation, and then Patricia began walking toward me, her smile carefully calibrated to appear warm but not desperate, pleased but not overwhelming. Harold followed a few steps behind, his expression neutral but watchful. "Victoria," Patricia said when she reached me, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal affection. "You look absolutely beautiful. Doesn't she look beautiful, Harold?" Harold nodded, extending his hand for a formal handshake rather than attempting a hug. "Victoria, you've certainly made quite a name for yourself in the business community." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in careful choreography. They asked about my work with genuine seeming interest, complimented my dress, and made small talk about mutual acquaintances. They mentioned, almost casually, how proud they were of my success and how they'd always known I'd find my way eventually. There were no apologies for the past, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused, but there were also no recriminations or renewed criticisms. It was, I realized, exactly what I'd secretly hoped for during those first few months of homelessness. A reconciliation that allowed everyone to save face. A reunion that focused on the present rather than relitigating the past. They were treating me like a successful adult daughter whose career they could respect, if not fully understand.
"We'd love to have you over for dinner sometime," Patricia said as our conversation wound down. "It's been far too long since we've had a proper family meal." "I'd like that," I heard myself saying, and realized I meant it. Whatever my parents' motivations for reconnecting, whatever calculated strategy had brought them to this moment, I was willing to try. Maybe they had changed. Maybe success had given me enough confidence to handle their criticism, if it resumed. Maybe we could build something new from the ashes of our old relationship. Harold smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. "Wonderful. Patricia will call you this week to arrange something." They moved on to greet other guests, leaving me feeling oddly hopeful. Around me, the gala continued with its careful rituals of networking and nostalgia, but I felt disconnected from it all. My mind was spinning with possibilities. What would dinner be like? Would they ask about my work, my life, my plans for the future? Would they finally acknowledge what had happened between us? Or would we all pretend those 3 years of silence had never occurred? Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia and I exchanged several phone calls arranging the dinner. The conversations were pleasant, even warm. She asked about my schedule, my dietary preferences, whether I was seeing anyone special. She mentioned that Harold was excited to hear more about my real estate ventures, and that they'd been reading articles about the local market with new interest. "We realize we never really understood what you were building," Patricia said during one call.
We'd love to learn more about your business if you're willing to share. This was more acknowledgement of past mistakes than I'd ever expected to receive. They were admitting, indirectly, that they'd been wrong about my potential and my choices. They wanted to understand the life I'd built without them, to appreciate the success they'd once dismissed as impossible. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening in early October. Patricia suggested I come early so we could have drinks and catch up properly before eating. Just the three of us, a chance to really reconnect as a family. I bought a bottle of wine, a $60 Pinot Noir that would have been unthinkable during my car sleeping days, and drove to Millbrook Heights with something approaching excitement. The tree-lined streets looked exactly as they had during my childhood, but I felt different driving through them. Instead of the anxiety that had characterized every return home during high school, I felt confident, accomplished, like someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. The house at 847 Maple Street looked immaculate as always. The gardens were perfectly maintained, the driveway was spotless, and the front steps were swept clean. Patricia opened the door before I could knock, greeting me with a hug that felt almost natural. "Victoria, come in, come in. Harold's in the study, but he'll be right out. Can I get you something to drink? Wine, coffee? We have that sparkling water you used to like." The house smelled like my childhood. Patricia's favorite vanilla candles mixed with the leather conditioning oil Harold used on his chair in the study. Nothing had changed. The same artwork hung on the walls, the same furniture occupied the same positions, even the same throw pillows were arranged in identical patterns on the sofa. Harold smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. "Wonderful. Right on time. How was the drive from Eastwick?" We settled in the living room with drinks, wine for me, scotch for Harold, mineral water for Patricia, and began what felt like a normal family conversation. They asked about my current projects, listened attentively to my explanations of market trends, and seemed genuinely impressed by my knowledge and experience. "You know," Harold said at one point, "I've been thinking about real estate investments myself. Patricia and I have some money sitting in low-yield savings accounts, and we're wondering if property might be a better option." This was unexpected. Harold had always been conservative with money, preferring traditional investments like stocks and bonds. The idea that he was considering real estate suggested either a significant shift in his thinking or some external pressure I wasn't aware of. "I'd be happy to discuss some options with you," I offered. "The market's been strong, but you have to be careful about timing and location." "We'd appreciate that," Patricia said. "Maybe you could look at some properties with us sometime, help us understand what to look for." As we moved to the dining room for dinner, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The warm glow of family acceptance. My parents were treating me as an equal, respecting my expertise, asking for my help. They wanted me in their lives not as a project to be molded, but as a successful adult whose knowledge and experience they valued. It was everything I dreamed of during those cold nights in my car, and it felt almost too good to be true. Which, as it turned out, it was. Dinner was perfect. Patricia had made my childhood favorite, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables. And Harold actually complimented my insights about the local real estate market. We talked about everything except the past, creating a bubble of normalcy that felt both fragile and precious. For 2 hours, I allowed myself to believe that we were just a normal family sharing a meal, and that the years of silence and pain had somehow been erased by mutual success and maturity. After dessert, Harold suggested we move to his study to continue our conversation about real estate investments. The study had always been his sanctuary. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the massive mahogany desk where he'd conducted business calls during my childhood. It was also where he'd delivered most of his disappointed lectures about my grades and future prospects.
But tonight felt different. Tonight, he was inviting me into his inner sanctum as an equal, as someone whose expertise he respected.
I followed him and Patricia into the study, wineglass in hand, feeling more relaxed than I had in their presence since elementary school. Harold closed the door behind us, something that immediately triggered a subtle alarm in my subconscious. Family conversations in the Hartwell house had never required closed doors unless something serious was happening. But I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe he just wanted privacy for discussing financial matters. "Victoria, sit down," Harold said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. Patricia took the chair beside me, close enough that I could smell her familiar perfume. Harold remained standing, which struck me as odd, but I was still floating on the warmth of our reconciliation and didn't pay enough attention to the warning signs. "We need to talk to you about something important," Patricia began, her voice taking on a serious tone I remembered from childhood conferences about my behavior or grades. "Something we've been dealing with privately, but we think it's time to bring you into the family discussion." Harold nodded gravely. "What your mother is trying to say is that we're facing some financial challenges that require family involvement to resolve." The word family hit me like a small shock. After 3 years of being dead to them, I was suddenly family again when they needed something. But I tried to stay open-minded. Maybe they genuinely wanted to include me in solving whatever problem they were facing. Maybe this was their way of treating me as an adult member of the family. "What kind of financial challenges?" I asked. Patricia and Harold exchanged a look, the kind of coordinated glance that suggested they'd rehearsed this conversation. Harold opened a folder on his desk and pulled out several documents. "The insurance industry has been difficult the past few years," Harold said. "My firm lost some major clients, and my income has been significantly reduced. We've been managing by dipping into savings, but that's not sustainable long term." "We're behind on some payments," Patricia added, her voice carrying just the right note of embarrassed admission. "Nothing catastrophic, but enough to be concerning. We need to make some adjustments to our financial situation." I felt a pang of sympathy. Whatever our history, I didn't want to see my parents lose their home or their financial security. "How far behind are we talking about? What kind of payments?" "The mortgage. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage." That was more serious than I had expected, but not insurmountable. "Okay, what's the total amount you need to catch up?" "Approximately $18,000, which, given your success in real estate, we hoped you might be able to help us with as a short-term loan." Here it was. The real reason for the reconnaissance, the gala encounter, the warm phone calls, the family dinner. They needed money, and they'd identified their estranged daughter as a potential source. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same feeling I'd had in childhood when I realized that their interest in my activities was purely transactional. But $18,000 was manageable for me now. I had that much in my business account, and helping them catch up on their mortgage wouldn't create any real hardship for me. Maybe this was how we could rebuild our relationship, through me being able to help them the way they never helped me. "I can probably manage that," I said. "We'd need to work out repayment terms, but—" "Actually," Harold interrupted, "we've been thinking about a more comprehensive solution, something that would benefit everyone involved." The knot in my stomach tightened. Harold's voice had shifted into what I recognized as his negotiation tone, the voice he used when he was about to present a deal that was more favorable to him than it initially appeared. "We'd like you to take over the mortgage entirely, become the legal owner of the house, with us remaining as tenants. It would solve our immediate financial problems, give you a solid real estate investment, and keep the family home in the family." I stared at them, trying to process what they were suggesting. "You want me to buy your house?" "We want you to assume our mortgage," Harold corrected.
The house is worth approximately $420,000. We owe $287,000. You'd be getting significant equity immediately, plus rental income from us to help cover the mortgage payments. How much rental income? I asked, my business mind automatically running calculations, even as my emotional mind reeled from the proposal. We were thinking $1,800 a month, Patricia said, which is below market rate for a house this size, but it's what we can afford. And you'd be building equity while helping family. The numbers didn't make sense. Market rent for a house like theirs in Millbrook Heights would be closer to $3,200 a month. They were asking me to subsidize their housing at roughly $1,400 a month, $16,800 per year, while taking on all the responsibilities and risks of ownership. That's significantly below market rate, I said carefully. But it's family, Harold said, leaning forward with the intense expression he used when he wanted something. And it's guaranteed income. No vacancy periods, no tenant searches, no property management headaches. Plus, we'll handle all the maintenance and upkeep ourselves. You'd essentially be a silent owner collecting rent checks.
I looked around the study, at the expensive furniture and artwork, at the evidence of a lifestyle that had been maintained even while they were falling behind on mortgage payments. Something wasn't adding up. If you can afford $1,800 in rent, why can't you afford the mortgage payments? I asked. Another exchanged glance. Harold cleared his throat. The mortgage payment is $2,400 per month. We can handle $1,800, but the extra $600 has been coming from savings, and we've exhausted that option. So, you want me to cover the additional $600 per month, plus all the costs of ownership, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, while you live in a house worth $420,000 for below market rent? The room fell silent. Harold's expression hardened slightly, the first crack in the evening's carefully maintained facade of family warmth. Victoria, Patricia said, her voice taking on the manipulative tone I remembered from my teenage years, we're trying to find a solution that helps everyone. We thought you'd want to help your family, especially since we're giving you an opportunity to own property in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the area. And frankly, Harold added, given everything we invested in your education and upbringing, we hoped you'd see this as an opportunity to give back to the people who made your success possible. There it was, the emotional manipulation, the guilt trip, the suggestion that I owed them something for the investment they'd made in me, the same investment they'd written off as worthless when they throw me out of this very house. The investment you made in me? I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. The investment you called worthless before you kicked me out? That was different, Patricia said quickly. We were disappointed and said things we didn't mean, but we're family, Victoria. Family helps family. Where was that philosophy 3 years ago when I was homeless? Where was family helps family when I was sleeping in my car and you were telling people I was probably on drugs? Harold's mask dropped completely. Don't be dramatic, Victoria. We gave you 18 years of food, shelter, education, and opportunities. If you chose to throw that away over a disagreement about your future, that was your decision. A disagreement about my future? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You called me worthless and threw my belongings on the lawn. And now you have the chance to prove that you're not, by helping your family when we need you. The manipulation was so blatant, so perfectly calibrated to my deepest insecurities, that I almost admired its audacity. They had orchestrated months of reconnaissance, arranged a public reconciliation, built up my hope for a renewed relationship, all to get me into this room for this moment, all to make me feel guilty enough to hand over my financial security for their benefit. "Get out," I said quietly. "Victoria," Patricia started. "Get out," I screamed, loud enough that both of them flinched. "I want you out of my life, again, forever this time." I headed for the door, but Harold's next words stopped me cold. "If you walk out that door, Victoria, you'll regret it more than you can imagine." I turned back to face him. "Is that a threat?" Harold smiled, and for the first time all evening, his expression was completely genuine. "It's a promise. You think you're so successful, so independent, but you have no idea how much we know about your business, your clients, your finances. And you have no idea how easy it would be for all of that to disappear." Patricia nodded, her warmth replaced by something much colder. "We've been watching you, dear, learning about you. You'd be surprised how much information people share when they think they're helping concerned parents reconnect with their daughter." The room spun slightly as I realized the full scope of their manipulation. The anonymous tips about properties, the mysterious information about potential listings, the social media reconnaissance. They hadn't just been gathering intelligence about my success. They'd been mapping my entire business network, identifying pressure points, preparing for this exact moment. "You're insane," I whispered. "We're desperate," Harold corrected, "and desperate people do whatever it takes to survive. The question is, are you going to help your family, or are you going to force us to use other methods to solve our problems?" I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and finally saw them clearly. Not as the authority figures who had shaped my childhood, not as the critics whose approval I desperately sought, but as two middle-aged people who were willing to destroy their own daughter to maintain their lifestyle. "Go to hell," I said, and walked out of their house for the second time in my life. But this time, I wasn't the powerless 18-year-old with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. This time, I was someone with resources, connections, and the knowledge to fight back. What I didn't know yet was that my parents were even more desperate than they'd let on, and their threats weren't empty promises. They were about to make good on every word, in ways that would make our previous conflict look like a gentle disagreement. The war was just beginning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of the conversation in Harold's study, analyzing every threat they'd made, every piece of information they'd revealed. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. How desperate were they really? How long had they been planning this manipulation? And most importantly, how much damage could they actually do to my business?
By 6 a.m., I was dressed and driving to my office. If my parents wanted to play hardball, they were about to discover that their worthless daughter had learned a few things about leverage and information gathering during her years in real estate. The first rule of negotiation is to understand exactly what each party has to gain or lose. It was time to find out what Harold and Patricia Hartwell were really hiding. I called Jennifer Martinez first. As my former boss and current mentor, she had connections throughout the real estate and banking communities that I could never access on my own. More importantly, she was one of the few people who knew my complete history with my parents and would understand why I needed this information. "Victoria, it's barely 7 in the morning," Jennifer said when she answered. "This must be important." "It is. I need you to help me research something, and I need you to keep it completely confidential." "Of course. What do you need?" "I need to know everything about Harold and Patricia Hartwell's financial situation. Everything. Mortgage status, credit history, business dealings, investments, whatever you can find through your banking contacts." There was a pause. "This is about your parents, isn't it?" "They tried to blackmail me last night into taking over their mortgage. They made some threats about my business that suggest they've been gathering intelligence on me for months.
I need to know what I'm really dealing with. Give me 2 hours, Jennifer said. And Victoria, be careful. Family money disputes can get uglier than you imagine. While I waited for Jennifer's call, I started my own investigation. I pulled property records for 847 Maple Street, researched Harold's insurance agency through state licensing databases, and searched public records for any lawsuits or liens involving either of my parents. What I found was more disturbing than I'd expected. The mortgage on their house wasn't just 3 months behind. It was in active foreclosure proceedings. The lender, Millbrook Savings and Loan, had already filed the necessary paperwork to begin the auction process. Based on the timeline, my parents had approximately 60 days before they lost the house entirely. But that wasn't the worst part. Harold's insurance agency, Hartwell and Associates, had been sued twice in the past 18 months by clients claiming negligent advice and mismanagement of their policies. One case had resulted in a $150,000 judgment against the company. Another was still pending, with the plaintiff seeking $300,000 in damages. I cross-referenced this information with state licensing records and discovered that Harold's insurance license was currently under review for ethical violations and professional misconduct. If the state board revoked his license, he'd lose the ability to earn income from the only profession he'd ever known. Patricia's situation was equally dire. Her social status had apparently been maintained through credit rather than actual wealth. She had outstanding balances on 7 different credit cards totaling nearly $80,000, with most accounts in collections. Her volunteer positions at various charities suddenly made more sense. She'd probably been using those activities to maintain social connections while hiding her family's financial collapse. Jennifer called back at exactly 9 a.m. with even more devastating information. "Victoria, your parents are in serious trouble," she said without preamble. "I talked to my contact at Millbrook Savings and Loan. They're not just behind on their mortgage, they've been trying to refinance for 8 months and been rejected by every lender they've approached." Why rejected? Debt-to-income ratio is completely upside down. Harold's agency has been losing money for 2 years. They've been living on credit and home equity loans to maintain their lifestyle. The house is leveraged to 95% of its value, and they have no realistic way to make the payments going forward. This was worse than simple cash flow problems. This was complete financial collapse disguised by expensive clothes and social events. "There's more," Jennifer continued. "My banking contact mentioned something interesting. Your parents have been asking questions about you specifically. They wanted to know about your income, your business assets, your creditworthiness. They were essentially trying to determine if you could qualify as a cosigner or guarantor for a refinance." "They've been planning this for months," I said, pieces clicking into place. The whole reconciliation was orchestrated to get me in a position where I'd feel obligated to help them. It gets worse, Victoria. They also asked about your client list, your business relationships, your professional reputation. They were mapping your entire network. The threats from the night before suddenly made perfect sense. Harold and Patricia had been conducting opposition research, identifying ways to damage my business if I didn't cooperate with their financial rescue plan. They knew which clients were most important to me, which professional relationships were most valuable, which aspects of my reputation were most vulnerable. "What kind of damage could they actually do?" I asked. "Significant," Jennifer said grimly. "Real estate is a relationship-based business. The right whisper campaign could destroy years of work. False rumors about ethics violations, suggestions of improper client relationships, questions about your professional competence, that kind of thing spreads fast in small business communities." I felt a cold rage building in my chest. My parents weren't just financially desperate. They were willing to destroy my career, my reputation, everything I'd built to solve their own problems. They were prepared to take down their own daughter to maintain their facade of middle-class respectability. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They thought I was still the powerless teenager who'd crumbled under their criticism and manipulation. They didn't understand that I'd spent 5 years learning how power really worked, how leverage could be used, how desperate people revealed weaknesses that could be exploited.
I called my lawyer, Michael Rodriguez, and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon.
Then I called my accountant to review my liquid assets and borrowing capacity. Finally, I called the one person I never thought I'd contact, David Shen at Millbrook Savings and Loan. David had been 2 years ahead of me in high school, and our paths had crossed occasionally in business circles. More importantly, his bank held my parents' mortgage, which meant he had access to information I needed and authority to make decisions that could change everything. Victoria Hartwell, David said when his secretary put me through, I was just thinking about you. Funny coincidence. Why were you thinking about me? Your parents' property at 847 Maple Street. We're moving forward with foreclosure, and your name came up in our research as someone who might be interested in purchasing it at auction. My heart stopped. My name came up how? Your parents mentioned you specifically when they were trying to negotiate a payment plan. They said their daughter was a successful real estate investor who might be willing to help with the situation. We thought you might want first opportunity to bid before it goes to public auction. They'd been using my name as leverage with their own bank, suggesting I was willing to help when they knew I'd been completely out of their lives for 3 years. They'd been lying to their lender about my involvement while simultaneously planning to manipulate me into that exact involvement. What's the minimum bid going to be? I asked. Outstanding balance plus fees and costs, approximately $295,000. I could afford that. Easily. The house was worth $420,000, which meant I'd be getting $125,000 in instant equity, plus one of the best properties in Millbrook Heights. As a pure business transaction, it was an excellent deal. As an act of poetic justice, it was priceless. David, I want to make a pre-auction offer. Full cash purchase, close in 2 weeks. $300,000, which gives the bank an extra $5,000 over the minimum and saves everyone the uncertainty of auction. Victoria, are you sure about this? Buying your childhood home in a foreclosure situation, it's going to create some family dynamics you might not be prepared for. I thought about Harold's threats, Patricia's manipulation, the months of reconnaissance they'd conducted to identify my vulnerabilities. I thought about being called worthless and thrown out in the rain. I thought about 5 years of building a life they'd tried to convince me I wasn't capable of living. I'm absolutely sure, I said. But I have one condition. I want the foreclosure process to continue normally until the day of closing. I don't want my parents to know I'm the buyer until the moment they lose the house. David was quiet for a long moment. Victoria, that's pretty harsh. They made their choice when they decided to threaten my livelihood. Now they get to live with the consequences. I'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning. After I hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the city I'd conquered through determination and hard work. In 2 weeks, I would own the house where I'd been told I'd never amount to anything. My parents would discover that their worthless daughter had become their landlord with the power to decide whether they had a place to live. But the sweetest part wasn't the revenge. It was the knowledge that I'd won using the exact skills they'd always said I didn't possess: business acumen, financial intelligence, and the ability to think strategically under pressure. Harold and Patricia Hartwell were about to learn that the daughter they'd thrown away had become everything they'd always pretended to be, and that their desperation had just handed her the ultimate victory. 2 weeks passed like a slow-motion disaster film. I watched from a distance as my parents scrambled to save their house, making frantic phone calls to relatives, posting desperate pleas on social media for business referrals, even attempting to organize a GoFundMe campaign that they quickly deleted when it became clear their social circle wasn't going to fund their lifestyle. Through Jennifer's banking contacts, I monitored their increasingly desperate attempts to find last-minute financing. They approached 17 different lenders, each one rejecting their application faster than the last. They tried to negotiate a payment plan with Millbrook Savings and Loan, offering to pay $500 per month towards the arrears, an income that would take them 6 years to catch up, assuming they never missed another payment. Most telling was the phone call I received from my Uncle Robert, Harold's younger brother, whom I hadn't spoken to since I was 16. "Victoria, I hope you don't mind me calling," he said, his voice uncomfortable. "Your father reached out to me about some financial difficulties they're having. He mentioned that you've become quite successful in real estate and might be able to help them avoid foreclosure." Even in their desperation, my parents couldn't bring themselves to call me directly. They were still trying to manipulate the situation through intermediaries.
still convinced they could find a way to get what they wanted without admitting they'd been wrong about everything. "What exactly did Harold tell you?" I asked. "He said there had been some kind of misunderstanding between you all, but that you were family and would want to help in a crisis. He seemed to think you had the resources to either loan them money or co-sign for a refinance." "Uncle Robert, did he mention that they kicked me out 3 years ago and told me I was worthless?"
Silence. Then he said you'd had a disagreement about your career path, but that you'd reconciled recently? We had dinner 2 weeks ago where they tried to blackmail me into taking over their mortgage and threatened to destroy my business if I didn't comply. Another long pause. Victoria, I had no idea. Harold made it sound like you were being stubborn about helping family. This was exactly what I'd expected. Even facing the loss of their home, my parents were spinning the narrative to make themselves the victims of my selfishness rather than acknowledging their own failures and manipulation. Uncle Robert, I want you to know that Harold and Patricia's financial problems are entirely of their own making, and their current situation is the result of living beyond their means for years while refusing to acknowledge reality. I believe you, he said quietly, and I'm sorry for bothering you with this. Your father was very persuasive, but I should have known there was more to the story. The closing was scheduled for Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. David Chen had arranged for the paperwork to be signed at Millbrook Savings and Loan, in the same conference room where my parents had probably pleaded their case dozens of times over the past few months. He'd also arranged for Harold and Patricia to be present for what they thought was a final negotiation meeting, where they'd be informed that the foreclosure was proceeding and they had 30 days to vacate the property. What they didn't know was that immediately after receiving that devastating news, they'd be introduced to their new landlord. I arrived at the bank at 2:45 p.m., using the side entrance to avoid being seen in the main lobby. David met me in his office to review the final documents before we joined my parents in the conference room. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" he asked, as I signed the last page of the purchase agreement. "Once we walk into that room, there's no going back. This is going to be traumatic for everyone involved." "David, they spent months planning to manipulate and blackmail me. They threatened to destroy my career to get what they wanted. They used my name as leverage with your bank while telling people I was probably on drugs. They had their chance to be decent human beings, and they chose manipulation instead." "I understand, but nothing. They're about to learn that actions have consequences and that the daughter they discarded is now in control of their future." At exactly 3 p.m., David led me down the hallway to conference room B. Through the glass window, I could see Harold and Patricia sitting at the oval table, both looking older and more worn than they had just 2 weeks earlier. Patricia was clutching a folder of documents, probably more desperate financing proposals that no lender would accept. Harold was staring at his hands, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of impending failure. David knocked and entered first. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for coming in today. I have some updates on your situation that we need to discuss." I waited in the hallway, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been grief. These were still my parents, still the people who had raised me, and I was about to become the agent of their complete humiliation. But they chose this path when they decided that manipulation and threats were acceptable tools for getting what they wanted from their own daughter. "I'm afraid the news isn't good," I heard David saying. "We've been unable to arrange any alternative payment plans, and the foreclosure process is proceeding as scheduled. You have 30 days from today to vacate the property." Patricia's voice, small and broken. "But we have nowhere to go. This is our home. We've lived here for 23 years. Harold, trying to maintain dignity. "Surely there must be some other option, some way to work this out." "Actually, there is something I need to tell you about the new owner. They've expressed interest in potentially working out a rental arrangement, depending on the circumstances." I could hear the desperate hope in Patricia's voice. "A rental arrangement?
Who bought the house? Maybe we could negotiate something. The new owner is here today and would like to speak with you directly about the possibilities. That was my cue. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked into the room. The silence that followed was absolute. Harold's face went white. Patricia's mouth dropped open. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. Finally, Patricia whispered, "Victoria." "Hello, Mother." "Father." Harold found his voice first, though it came out as a croak. You bought our house?" "I bought the house that you were losing to foreclosure, yes. And now we need to discuss what happens next." Patricia started crying, not the delicate tears of a woman maintaining her composure, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone's world was collapsing in real time. Harold just stared at me with an expression of complete disbelief, as if he couldn't process the reality of the situation. "Please don't do this to us," Patricia managed between sobs. "We're your parents. We raised you. We fed you. You threw me out and called me worthless. You told everyone I'd probably end up on drugs. 2 weeks ago, you tried to blackmail me into solving your financial problems and threatened to destroy my career when I refused." Harold finally seemed to understand the full scope of what had happened. "You planned this. You knew we were in foreclosure, and you planned this." "I planned nothing. You created the situation through your own choices and your own failures. I simply recognized an opportunity when it presented itself." "What do you want from us?" Harold asked, his voice defeated.
That's what we're here to discuss, I said, taking a seat at the table across from them. You see, I'm willing to consider a rental arrangement. The question is what kind of tenants you're going to be. Patricia looked up from her tears, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "We'll pay whatever you ask. We'll be perfect tenants. The market rate for this house is $3,200 per month, plus utilities, which would be your responsibility. First month, last month, and security deposit due before move-in." Harold's face flushed red. "Victoria, that's nearly $10,000 up front. You know we don't have that kind of money." "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before you made poor financial decisions for years and tried to manipulate me into fixing them." "So what?" Patricia asked desperately. "What are you really asking for?" I leaned back in my chair and looked at these two people who had shaped my childhood with their impossible standards and conditional love, who had thrown me away when I didn't meet their expectations, who had tried to use me as a financial resource while threatening everything I'd built. "I'm asking for the same thing you taught me to expect from family relationships," I said. "Complete compliance with my terms, no questions asked, and gratitude for the privilege of being allowed to stay." The room fell silent again as the full irony of the situation settled over them. Their worthless daughter was now their landlord, and they were about to discover exactly what it felt like to be at the mercy of someone who held complete power over their living situation. "There's just one more thing we need to discuss," I said, pulling a lease agreement from my briefcase. "The terms and conditions of your tenancy." What those terms were, and whether Harold and Patricia Hartwell would accept them, would determine not just where they lived, but whether they could rebuild any kind of relationship with the daughter they'd tried to destroy. Because sometimes the best lessons about family loyalty come from experiencing its complete absence. And sometimes the people who taught you that love was conditional discover what it feels like when the conditions finally turn against them.